Great. Hi everyone, and welcome to Rufus Duets on our conversation around male allyship and education in schools around consent and street harassment. Thank you very much for joining the Lambeth Anti-Harassment Campaign. We're very excited to hear from you about this. Do you want to give us a bit of an introduction as to who you are, what you do, and how long you've been doing it?
So I'm a philosophy teacher at the West London Independent School, one of the schools that was mentioned on the Everybody's Invited website at the beginning. And I've been a member of the Women's Equality Party for a long time. And I occasionally give relationships and sex education, but mainly I deliver philosophy lessons. But the fact that I've been there for a long time has given me some insight into the sort of culture that manifested itself with the disclosures on Everyone's Invited.
I bet it has. Thank you. And I know there's been a lot in the media about sexual harassment and sexual abuse in schools and education around this and how important it is. So to what extent do you think actually rape culture does exist in schools, and what are the manifestations you are seeing in young boys?
So there's no doubt that it exists, right? And that's really important to say. And I think it's excellent that it has surfaced in a way that it hadn't before, I think. So I think we all knew it existed, but it was difficult to sort of bring it to attention, I think. And this website has somehow, because it's anonymous, I guess, has sort of flushed it out. And so it's not ignorable anymore, and it's gained a lot of media attention, which I think is excellent. I think what I would define rape culture just as they do on Everyone's Invited, which is like this. They basically say that rape culture exists when sexual violence and sexual coercion is normalized, right? Where it is not associated with any sort of punishment, whether that's a sort of official punishment or even a peer culture punishment. And I think that's the crucial thing. When within a peer group, sexual violence is normalized, then you have rape culture. And then the rest is just the degree that you get, basically. Do you see what I mean?
And how are kids talking about it? How are they reacting to this culture of normalization of violence against women?
I mean, we don't have any girls, and I think that means that it's been harder for us as a school to sort of pick it up. I have to, it's rare that a kid will say something outrageous within a classroom setting, no matter, and it's difficult to listen into their private conversations. But nevertheless, there are hints, right? And so it does exist. I have been pleased with the way that older boys at the school have reacted to Everyone's Invited. And there's been a real sense of taking responsibility. So I think it's very important for men to realise that it's a mistake to respond with "not all men," right? Because and that suggests a defensiveness, which you might want to wonder why that's there. The point is, it's not all men, but all men are responsible as peers for the sort of culture that exists. We're all responsible for that, whether we're guilty of sexual harassment or not, especially if it's only boys within a school environment. So I do feel that the older boys have tried to take on responsibility and tried to take it seriously and, crucially, listen, right, and read what's there on the website and the way in which people are reacting to it. The younger boys have been, I think, kind of troubled by it. They don't know what to make of it. And that has been, I think, a little bit disappointing. So I think there's a sort of, there's certainly a difference made in terms of the age of the boys. But my hope is that there will be a generation of boys that have been really affected by this, and going to university will have much better attitudes, and will be just be much more aware of their own behaviour and the behaviour of their peers, and moderate it much better. There'll be much better bystanders, right? That's the crucial thing. If people who work with men in dealing with sexual harassment and sexual violence tend to focus on being good bystanders, right? We need to call everything out so that nothing is tolerated, so that the culture can't exist, right? And that's difficult you have to be brave as a man to kind of go against your own peer culture. It comes often at a social cost. It could even come at a physical cost if it's someone you don't know and they take offense. But I don't see another way of dealing with it other than changing peer cultures. And the way to do that is by effectively training people to be good, training men in particular to be good bystanders, and to sort of intervene.
And what do you think is causing the culture that you're talking about in schools?
So here's a thought that I think is very important, but I haven't heard aired on the radio in much media discussion of this. Take the workplace. There is sexual harassment at the workplace, but very rarely, I think, will a male sexually harass their boss if their boss is female, or even if their boss is male, right? You don't sexually harass someone where there's a big cost to doing so. And so what that shows, I think, is that it happens because there's a power dynamic that has been established. And whether it's real or not, it's the boys kind of have imbued it. And they've imbued it from the media they've been growing up with, from the society around them. So by the time they get to 13 or 14, they perceive a sort of power relationship between them and their female peers, such that sexual harassment comes at no cost to them. It doesn't come at a cost to a peer, in a peer setting. It won't matter because these people won't be their employers. It won't matter because the police don't get involved. And so it's fundamentally caused, I think. Well, I mean, it has many causes, right? But one of the fundamental things that people haven't said is that the power relationship is already established, and that's what causes it. If you eradicate that, so that 13, 14-year-old boys see their female peers as genuine equals, then it wouldn't happen. That's my view. It's because of a sort of endemic disrespect, I think, that our culture just breeds, and that's what I would say. So, and that has important ramifications for the way we tackle it. So, for example, people have blamed porn culture, right, for this. And I'm not going to say that porn isn't a huge problem and an exacerbator. But I don't think it explains it alone. I think if boys are watching really harmful pornography, there's a problem already there, I think, right? And that's why they're watching it. So it's more fundamental than that. And what I would say is this. We have to surround boys, in particular, when they're growing up, with female role models for them to empathize with. If you analyze children's books, you'll find that almost all the characters are male, such a high percentage. Almost all the animals are male, and boys are only ever forced to empathize with other male characters. And if only you could really turn that dynamic, and whose responsibility is that? Well, it's authors, it's publishers, it's people writing cartoons, it's the media in general. They need to have a real focus on more female representation across all the sorts of experiences that young boys will have. And then I think once you've got that, you will get a more equal experience in primary school, a more equal experience going into secondary school when they hit puberty, and they might be repulsed by some of the pornography that they might be currently enjoying, right? So that's what I'd say. I wouldn't say pornography is not part of the problem, but I would say it's also a symptom of something more fundamental, which is that there is this... we bring up boys not to empathize properly with girls. That's what I think.
Thank you. I completely agree. I think all of that is really interesting. I really take your point about the wide range and sheer volume of external influences around boys and how this just has impacts on them throughout their formative years. I suppose It seems like education providers, given they have so much influence in creating safe spaces and environments for boys to discuss this, could be doing so much in this area and perhaps should be doing so much in this area. But these topics are really hard to discuss. They're advanced. They're about sexual consent. They're really difficult. They're complicated. They're personal. So how do you talk to pupils? How do you talk to young boys about consent? How do you talk to them about these issues?
Well, it's not easy. I mean, it might be easy when they're 18, right? And they've got some experience to draw on that. But when they're 13, 14, of course, before they have the experiences, they need to have the conceptual framework in place, right? So you have to start really early. And that's one thing we could say. It's great that it's now compulsory to have relationship sex activity, but it has to start very early. The messages need to be reinforced throughout, rather than the sort of statutory one lesson a year, tick, done it. The kids know about consent. They've watched the T video. We can now move on, right? It can't really be like that. It has to be ongoing. One colleague recently said to me that when he last taught his lesson on consent, he didn't talk about consent much. He said, look, I assume that you know enough about consent, right? Everything I'm going to tell you, you're just going to nod along. The thing is, how do I actually get you to think in this way when you're at a party and you're drunk, right? Rather than when you're in the classroom with a teacher. So I think that is one really important point, that we need to focus on getting the kids to understand that this applies to situations where they might be compromised. Their decision-making is compromised. They're under the influence of peer pressure, and they're under the influence of alcohol and drugs. And so there's a sense in which it's not an academic discussion, right? The only way of doing that is to give them lots and lots of scenarios, lots and lots of case studies, for them to kind of think through, to get into the mindset of doing it when they're actually in the situation themselves. But I'd also say this, now this might say a little bit controversial, but I think if you focus on consent, you're actually focusing on the wrong thing. Because if there is a slightly unequal power relationship, boys assume very quickly that they've got consent, when really what they've got is coercion, right? And I think boys need to understand that consent cannot be coerced. If you read a lot of the disclosures on Everyone's Invited, a lot of them are about sort of coerced going along with it, right? I'm really unhappy about this, but I'm not going to do anything more to kind of resist. The easiest way out of this situation is just to kind of go along with it and deal with the consequences afterwards. And that's really sad. But it's inevitable if boys kind of think that their interests come first in the first place. If you have a more equal relationship to start with, then I think boys will understand that you cannot coerce consent. So if there's if there's negotiation involved, if there's pressure involved, then you're never going to get consent. Do you see? So I think if you focus simply on, did she not say no, right? You'll never get the right message across. But if you focus on, are you applying unhelpful pressure, or are there factors that are compromising the decision-making, like she's unconscious, or, she's had too much to drink, then I think, or she's just too young, right? Because technically you can't consent in the UK before you're 16, right? There are getting to focus on the situations where consent is just impossible, right? Rather than on, what consent might look like in some situations, which is when someone just doesn't say no. I think that's really important. So the word consent is a problem word, unfortunately. Another thing I'd say, which I think is really important, is this. Some people have come up to me after lessons I've done on RSE and said, but sir, don't you think that there's a grey area? And we'll try hard, but there's grey areas and we get things wrong. And I would say this. I would say no. There isn't a grey area, right? There are clear boundaries, but it's sometimes difficult to know exactly where they are. In particular, if you're drunk, you can make mistakes. But it's not that the boundary's not there. It's not that the boundary's not vague. The boundary's there. It's just sometimes difficult for you to see it. And so you need to be responsible, right? So that you can get into a position where, if you're in, where in a situation where it matters, you can judge where that line is accurately. That's what I'd say to people who say there's grey areas, I think. But sorry, that was all about how to talk to pupils about it. So I think in the long and short of it is focus on coercion maybe, as well as consent, but also real-life situations, as many of them as possible, discussed with the kids so that they can live through it and empathise with it. and rather than some sort of academic discussion about rights. And also get them to really listen to testimonies, right? To understand the effects that their actions, their unthinking actions, can have on other people. Effects that they might be sort of blind to, right? Because so much of the kind of pain that you read on everyone's environment has just been internalized. It's just been hidden for years, right? So if boys don't know, they didn't realize that it had this effect. So I think getting them to really be sensitive to the effects that their actions can have, which of course starts with proper empathy and an equal and respectful relationship, I would say is really, really important.
So sort of giving them the knowledge, getting them to apply empathy to that knowledge, and then getting them to apply that knowledge to actual scenarios they're going to find themselves in, is sort of what you're saying.
I think that's at least part of the solution when it comes to secondary schools and primary schools as well, when you're doing RSE in the classroom. But there are wider things that schools can do. So schools need proper policies. Many schools don't have proper policies on sexual harassment, and they don't need to because Ofsted doesn't check, right? They should do, according to statutory guidance, but does Ofsted look at it? Not really. So Ofsted needs to be really hot on this. That will get the schools to be really hot on this. They need proper policies, and it's really tricky, right? You need policies that encourage victims to come forward, and that is difficult. And schools need to really learn, I think, because it seems, at least from everyone's invited, that schools have had policies that have really come at a cost to the victims, right? Where victims have either been ignored or been kind of hushed up, or not having to, sit next to the kid in the next lesson, right? And eventually they've left the school because it's too difficult it's too much of a trauma. And I think that's partly because we've got the wrong policies. It might also be because schools try and protect their reputations, and that needs to be taken out of the picture as well. But I think really thoughtful policies, ways of reporting these incidents without really any cost, I think, is absolutely kind of essential, I think. But they also, you need teachers to be much more on board and to understand the way they reinforce sexism with their language, and they reinforce sexism with the books that they teach and the authors they quote and the pictures they put on the walls. All of these things that lead to a sort of male default way of thinking need to be challenged, and teachers need to become aware of it. So that teachers need training on sexism in schools and the damage it does and how to tackle it. Because a lot of people do terrible things. I think they're terrible, but people do things unthinkingly, right? You use language that is harmful without reflecting on it. You call someone hysterical, not realizing the kind of misogyny that's in that word, right? Because it's just a word that we use. But the more reflection that teachers are forced to do, I think would be really, really important. And I also think every school, this was one of the wet policies that was signed through at the last conference, right? Every school needs to have a sort of lead, a person who is responsible and takes money for driving through a whole school program of eradicating sexism and sexual violence, right? And that might, that will involve RSD lessons, but it will also involve giving teachers inset, having a budget to get external speakers like Laura Bates in, that sort of thing. You need a single point of call. Otherwise, things just get lost by committee. That's my experience, right? If nobody's really in charge and no one's really accountable, then nothing actually changes. Nothing actually happens.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here, and all your thoughts have been extremely relevant, I think, to the discourse happening at the moment, and very insightful.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.